either introduce or add more information to what you already know about the roots of James Lewis Johnson in Maryland. And I know in your interpretive material, you talk about his Maryland roots, but I think that what is really interesting is to see where he came from, where his family came from, what they were involved in, and how that might have, and obviously did, influence his future in Santa Fe. So where are we? We are in Maryland, and it's considered Western Maryland, but it's only an hour by car now from Washington, D.C. to the north and west, and an hour by car from Baltimore to the basically to the west. Frederick County is one of the largest counties in Maryland. Traditionally, it was a very rich agricultural area. It is actually, interestingly enough, the city of Frederick, which is the main town in the county, is not on a river, although it's a very early 18th century town. And it was a town in which people like Lewis and Clark did some of their outfitting for their expedition west. Lafayette came to Frederick. It was very much an important Piedmont town in the 18th and 19th century, and continues now to be a bedroom community for both Washington and Baltimore. What's interesting about Frederick County is that while its roots are principally agricultural, it is right at the toe of the Catoctin Mountains, part of the Appalachian Range, which run northeast to southwest across Pennsylvania, Maryland, and then into Virginia. And as a place that is literally at the toe of the mountains, iron was very close to the surface. And in the 18th century, as you may know, iron was an incredibly valuable commodity. England was having to buy their iron from Sweden or France, and I'm not sure which one was a bigger enemy and which one, frankly, they hated more. But when the colonies came along, they were absolutely thrilled to begin getting their iron from the colonies. And as such, Catoctin figured very large in that industry and in that economy. So one of the things that I want to talk about today, in addition to giving you a background of Catoctin Furnace, is what we know about the Johnson family and how that relates to James Lewis Johnson. So I want to quote this really interesting history of the Johnson family written by James Lewis Johnson's father in 1842. And you can kind of hear him writing this, or as you read it, you can sort of picture him writing it. He says, and these are direct quotes, "I was born May 28th, 1774. My great-grandfather was a lawyer in Liverpool. My grandfather, Thomas, owned a beautiful farm in Culver County, that's also in Maryland, on the Eastern Shore, and married Doris Sedgwick." And I'll point out that the Sedgwick family was a very esteemed, well-heeled, shall we say, family in early Maryland. He goes on to say, this is James Lewis Johnson's father writing this in 1842. He says, "My father, James," they're all named James, so just bear with me here. "My father, James, who was born in 1736 and died in 1809, by industry and good management, acquired the property I unfortunately lost during the pressure and troubles of the times." So James Lewis Johnson's father was not a good businessman, which may have been one of the influences for James to go west, young man. But anyway, he goes on to say that his father married Peggy Skinner against the will of some of the family, and never happier or more contented couple, which I think is an interesting thing to pass on to your family. James married Ann Richards and had 7 children, and James Lewis Johnson was the youngest. He was the last born. He was born February 14th, Valentine's Day as we know it now, in 1825 in Baltimore, because by this time, his branch of the Johnson family had lost the Catoctin Manor, the big house, if you will, and had moved to Baltimore, was living in, I'm not going to say reduced circumstances, but it does not appear that they had, it appears that they only had one person helping in the household, which was a huge change, if you will, in circumstance from their earlier financial and social or financial position. So anyway, as you know, James Lewis traveled to Mexico in 1845 at the age of 20, and he settled in Santa Fe, and the rest is you know the history of. So by the time James Lewis was born in 1825, the Johnson family no longer owned Catoctin Furnace, his branch of the family, although his great uncle William lived nearby in another mansion called Haylands. And I'll describe this later, but Catoctin Furnace is literally ringed by the mansions of the Johnsons and later families who made a great deal of money off the iron industry. And when I say mansions, these are 22-room, 20-room mansions built at the time of the Revolution. Those would be mansions today. So, you know, dial back 250 years, and they're just, you know, they're a testament to the amount of money that could be made in the iron industry. But I want to point out that the Johnson family had a long history of enslavement. And William, just giving one example here, he continued the Johnson tradition of enslavement when one of his enslaved individuals by the name of George Brooks died of lung congestion during the Civil War. William claimed his $300 bounty for Brooks's service, which is kind of hard to wrap your head around, but unfortunately was not at all an uncommon situation in Maryland and in other Eastern slaveholding states. So James Johnson, there's James, James, and James. So James Johnson Sr., call him, was really known as the brother who knew how to make iron. So the Johnsons were, shall we call it, vertically integrated in their ability, in their business dealings. Baker was a lawyer and a financier. Thomas became the first governor of Maryland. Joshua was in London with his counting house and his trading house in London. And James knew how to make iron. James had been at an earlier furnace called Green Spring, the next county west of Catoctin, and then moved to Catoctin in this ramp up to the Revolutionary War. And one of the questions for years has been, we knew that Catoctin made cannonballs used at the Siege of Yorktown, which was, as you know, a pivotal battle in the Revolution. But just last year, actually, we found in the National Archives this very, very interesting bill of payment, not just an order, but an actual payment, which means that they actually did make the cannon. So they made cannon, sold to a ship and or several cannon, and were paid $185.55 current money. And James was the one who received that money in 1781, right in the middle of the Revolution. So that was big news for us. So And this is a testament to not only the enormous number of cannonballs that Catoctin made, and pots, because each soldier had to have a kettle. They also made salt pans. Of course, they produced pig iron that then blacksmiths would use. But making cannon was a very, very precise and frankly difficult thing to do. So we're very pleased to now know beyond a shadow of a doubt that Catoctin and James's grandfather produced cannon for the Revolution. So this is James the Elder, who was at Green Spring. This is his grave marker, because of course the family was all here before James Lewis went west. I know you all have probably seen this many times. This is a family tree, and you can see there's James, the seventh child of James, son of James, and he then came to Santa Fe and had, as I think you probably already know, seven children. And I'm assuming some of the descendants are still in the Santa Fe area. We do know that some of the other Johnsons are in Kansas, they're in Pennsylvania. We've been able to contact a number of people in various states across the country. So where did James Sr., James Jr. then lost it? And where would have James Lewis's sort of ancestral home, where would it have been? Well, it was right at Catoctin Furnace. This is what it looks like. It is called Spring Fields. It has spring in each of its 7 fields. And behind it is a mountain. This is an interesting photo because there's a lot of fog coming off the mountain, so you can't see, but the mountain rises right behind Springfields. It is a lovely 18th century structure. If you're an architectural historian, you may look at this and say, what's going on there? That 3rd story was added after the initial 5-bay structure was built, raising the roof and making a third floor. But it was a 1,030-acre manor, and it was very, very close to the actual furnace, just the length of several football fields. So there was a connection of the enslaved between Springfields and the agrarian part of the enterprise, feeding everyone and growing crops, and then, of course, the iron industry itself. So as I've alluded, we know that the Johnsons were slave holders. They had a great many slaves. I believe when Baker died, he had 70 some, James somewhere in the less than that, but still quite a high number. One of the things that we have been able to locate are some of the freedom seeker ads that James and Baker, his brother, published, looking for some of the individuals who had decided to emancipate themselves and try to get north to freedom. Harry and Len are 2. We do not know if they were successful in their escape, but we know a great deal about them based on these very detailed freedom seeker ads. So we know, as I've already recounted, a great deal about the Johnsons. We have the records that they diaries and letters like the one I just quoted that they left. We have ecclesiastical records from their Anglican church called All Saints in Frederick. We have a great many records that are purchases of land and sales of land, purchases of people, sales of people. So we know a great deal about them. But what we didn't know and are still learning is the African American population, because as Catoctin Furnace was being sort of studied, if you will, starting at the 50 years ago at the time of the bicentennial, it really did lack a collective memory that included the African American population. So our goal in these past 13 and a half years has been to change that narrative and fully incorporate the African American population into the history of iron making at Catoctin. So Catoctin has, I'm showing you a map here that, kind of to help orient you, because the iron furnace is on the National Register and has been since the early 1970s. However, the village goes far beyond that and expands out into what we are now calling the greater furnace lands. So one of the things that we're doing is figuring out just where these houses were, where the landscapes through which people moved, and how that influenced them and their lives. And one of those things, of course, is the cemetery. This is an artist's rendition of Catoctin Furnace that I like to share, because I think it really gives you a bit of an idea of what the layout of the center of the village would have been like. And this is before the church was built in the 1820s. So you can see that black slash in the back. That's the actual mine for the iron. And then you can see the rows of houses. They were both stone and frame log. And then you see the operation of the furnace itself. But on the right-hand side, what you see is the Iron Master's mansion. And this was positioned in such a way that from the Iron Master's bedroom, he and his family could look out and sort of in a panoptic manner, if you will, survey and surveil the entirety of the complex. And that, of course, is a way to control population, control movement, control behavior. And so this image really points that out, I think, in a very easy way to understand the layout of the village. So we've been talking about James, but James's brother Thomas, as I said earlier, became the first governor of Maryland, and his brothers, were equally, maybe not equally influential politically, but certainly equally influential in other aspects. I like to point out that was 250 years ago. Their wealth and their privilege gave them the ability to become politically and socially, powerful. And the juxtaposition of that is this forensic facial reconstruction that we have created of one of the enslaved females. We do not know her name. From her DNA, we do know something about her family and where she was from in Africa, but we do not know anything else, about her. So the contrast of the information that's available between these two people who are contemporaries is striking. One of the things that the power of the Johnsons going forward and the power of Catoctin Furnace, it still resonates today. Obviously, it resonates in your historical society and structure in Santa Fe. But, Thomas was the first governor of Maryland. Louisa Johnson Adams was first lady. She's Joshua's daughter. She married John Quincy Adams, obviously was first lady of the United States. And then the president of the EU, Ursula von der Leyen, is a direct descendant of John Bryn, who bought the furnace in 1820 after the Panic of 1819. And so the political power, if you will, that resonates from Catoctin continues right up into the present day. At the time of the Johnsons, James, Thomas, Baker, and Roger, between 15 and 20 stone and log houses were built, and they, over the years, more and more were added, so that at the height of the furnace, there were as many as 80 workers' cottages in the village. And so one of the things that we've been doing is dendrochronology. We've been dating all the structures and figuring out, or trying to figure out, we'll never know who actually lived in them, because they were all owned by the company, and no individual, we can't do a title search, for ownership, because they were not individually owned. However, the archaeology that we're doing in each and every structure is telling us a great deal about the daily lives of the individuals. I'm going to talk a little bit now about iron, because it is something that made the Johnson fortune and obviously influenced the family from which James Lewis Johnson came. There are 4 natural resources at Catoctin that allowed it to become an iron-making center. I mentioned earlier, we're at the toe of the Catoctin Mountains, so we had iron within 10 to 12 feet of the surface, as opposed to 100 feet or more. So it was very easy, relatively speaking, of course, easy for me to say, right? It was easier to mine. We also have outcroppings of limestone. Limestone is the flux for iron. We have streams coming off the mountain that are steady. They're not rivers, they're streams. They're steady for turning a water wheel. That, of course, was the power that would open and close would turn the water wheel and then open and close the bellows to shoot hot air, or shoot air rather, into the tuyere to bring the furnace up to over 2,000 degrees to make iron. And then we had a mountain of hardwood, and the wood was then cut, stacked, burned in a reduced oxygen atmosphere for up to 2 weeks, and that made the charcoal, and that was the fuel. So we had those 4 natural resources, but of course, the 5th and most important component was the enslaved workers, who were the labor, the expertise for making the iron. One of the things we've been doing is trying, as I said earlier, to understand the full cultural landscape through which these people moved, and to try to understand more about their lives. We've done LIDAR, and we have been able to identify the pits where the charcoal was made. And I kind of call this the craters of the moon, because it kind of looks like that. But these are the actual scars, if you will, on the mountain that show where the charcoal hearths were. Notice that they're kind of equally positioned, because a collier, that's the person making the charcoal, would be tending multiple pits at a time. So they would be moving amongst them, making sure that they were burning correctly, not burning too fast, not burning too slow. And they would also reuse them at about a 30-year period. This is an example of one as it would appear today. If you were hiking in the mountain, you would see this and you might think, oh, isn't that interesting that that's slightly flat and maybe the soil's a little dark. But that is exactly what it is. That is the base of a charcoal hearth. So we were a cold blast furnace, and this, you can see the water coming in, turning the wheel, opening and closing the bellows, which is going into the tuyere, going into the hearth, and then you can see the iron pigs coming out, which are the molten iron. This is an illustration of that furnace tapping process producing the pig iron. And this was an incredibly dangerous but highly skilled activity, as were all of the jobs at the furnace. As we always say at Catoctin Furnace, there's no such thing as an unskilled iron worker. And what did they make? So here is a James Johnson and Company jam stove plate, dated 1776, and then a 1786 Johnson and Company 6-plate stove. And you can see the iconography, that they're very finely made. Catoctin was known for the quality of their iron and the quality of their stoves. They're just really works of art that came from the expertise of of the enslaved workers working under the Johnsons at Catoctin. So several years ago, we were looking at this photograph, which was always called a mule barn. The photograph was identified as that of the mule barn at Catoctin, and we realized that, in fact, you never put a chimney, a fireplace in a barn. So we realized that it was, in fact, the slave quarters. Unfortunately, it doesn't stand anymore, but we have been able to reconstruct it digitally, virtually. So if you go on our website, you can see that. And it's a very cool way of being able to move through the space. We also have been looking at how the other houses like Springfield's, like Vallenay, like Auburn, these are the mansions that ring the furnace, how they were able to survey and surveil the working. And so looking at a bare earth model, we could see that the owners certainly, they could see the furnace from their house. They could have direct oversight and therefore control over the operation, even without being on site, if you will, at the operation, at the furnace. So making iron is a very dirty and dangerous thing. We know, for instance, that we have one of our enslaved individuals who is completely full of zinc, and that would have possibly one of the medical results of that is ALS and other terrible diseases. But we know that we had a great deal of zinc in our samples of iron and in at least one of the individuals in the cemetery. So that brings me to how we know as much as we are learning about the enslaved population, because that memory had been lost. There was no one in the area who trace their ancestry back to the enslaved at Catoctin. There are many reasons for that. We now understand one of the reasons is it was so long ago. It was way before the Civil War that the enslaved were moved away from Catoctin to other furnaces that were the later owners had in other counties. But again, the memory had been lost. So when a roadway was being planned in the 1970s, the excavation that took place as part of that roadway planning process uncovered an African-American cemetery, and 35 graves were excavated, and 32 individuals were present in those graves. And this map shows you where those graves were. Nails and screws from the coffins were found. As you can probably imagine, I won't be showing any photographs of the skeletal remains of the individuals, but I will be showing the pins, for instance, and buttons. Only the men had buttons. The women would have had just what are called tapes to pull to keep their clothing together. But we do have a number of buttons of various types that were buried with some of the men. So the demography of the population, there were 35, but as I said, 3 had no remains, probably based on the acidic soil. I'll draw your attention to the 10 to 19 year age range. That's the preponderance, or the largest percentage of our individuals are in that range, which is a very unusual thing. Teenagers are, they're not neonates. They're not old. They should be the smallest death population, if you will, in a cemetery. But in fact, they're our largest. We have several reasons that we think that occurred: overwork, not allowing the lack of good food, not allowing rest when people became ill. But it's very it's something that we don't really understand, but it's a strikingly obvious percentage of teenagers dead in the cemetery. One of the things that we're doing is trying to put together who was at Catoctin based on diaries and letters and probate records, sales of individuals. So we do have some names that belong to James and Baker, as well as other owners, but we don't have any way of connecting those names directly with the individuals that have been excavated at the cemetery. We're also working on making connections to Africa, and we are having good success with that based on the DNA in our direct-to-consumer database that we're working with, which is 23andMe. And here are some areas, and this is really interesting. We have West Africa, of course, and then way to the south as well. We actually know now that some of our individuals are only from 1 or 2 ethno-linguistic groups in Africa, so they would have been quite probably recent arrivals in the New World or in the colonies and the young United States. And we have another individual who's related to 9 ethno-linguistic groups, all the way from the north in what is now Tunisia to the south in South Africa. That kind of mixing across the entire continent of Africa would have been very unlikely to have taken place in Africa. So this little toddler, is likely the result of families that were in the young United States or the colonies for several generations and intermarried with people from other parts of Africa in that manner. We have an interesting condition. We have sickle cell, which is a genetic condition in the African American population. We also have craniostenosis, which is a premature closure of the growth plates in the skull. And this is, again, a genetic condition, but we 6 out of 32, so it's a very high percentage, as you can see. I liken this to the bust of Nefertiti, if you are familiar with that. That's in Berlin. It's this longer, sort of elongated skull shape. So we teamed with the Reich Lab at Harvard, David Reich and Henry Louis Gates, to begin this DNA research, and we have now finished 27 successful out of the 32, 27 successful genomes, and we've been able, based on that, to put together 5 families that are closely related in the cemetery, and then the other individuals, as you can see from this chart, are unrelated to those 5 families. The families, for instance, mother, child, brother, sister, very close nuclear families. that we've been able to identify. And you can see, and I like to point out that the families are closely, in most cases, closely buried together. So I feel like I better hurry up because I'm almost finished, but I don't want to go over time here. So we are also looking at other census records. We're calling it a census. It's not the same as as the federal census, but what we're putting together to try to get names for our research to try to connect people who are alive today to their ancestors who would have been at Catoctin. At the cemetery, we've done ground penetrating radar to try to see if there are additional graves, and there are. There are as many as 27 additional graves. This map shows you in the green outline, the area that was excavated in 1979 and 1980, and you can see some of that is actually under the roadway. And then the orange outline is the area that is still extant at the cemetery. And these are the results of the ground penetrating radar. You can see the grave shafts. They're pretty obvious in the in the ground penetrating radar. There's no plan to excavate them or disturb them in any way. The graves are all the markers that are in the graveyard are all local stone, but some are pointed, some are rounded, some are cryptocrystalline, so they reflect light. They do not have any obvious or discernible markings on them, although one of the things we'd like to do is if we get a research grant to do it, which we're working on, is put these under an electron scanning microscope to see if there's something that can be seen on the stones that we can't see. So one of our programs at Catoctin is to incorporate young people into the historic preservation and archaeology and research and foodways. And so these are some of our students that helped restore our bed and breakfast, which is called the Forgeman's House. And this photo shows the two forensic facial reconstructions that we were able to create, or Studio Ice in Brooklyn, New York was able to create for us. So that finishes my presentation, and I am absolutely happy to answer any questions that you might have.